Right, so orcs. If you've spent any time at all in Middle-earth, and I mean any, the books, the films, or just soaking it all up secondhand the way most of us did growing up, then you already have a rough idea of what an orc is. Sort of. You know they're the bad lot, the ugly ones. The ones who come pouring over a hillside in their thousands so that somebody noble can cut them down while the music swells and we all feel rather good about it. And that's the thing that's always quietly nagged at me. Orcs are, by a huge margin, the most numerous people in all of Middle-earth. There are more of them than elves, more than dwarves, more than the men of Gondor and Rohan put together. And yet, they're the ones we understand the least. We cheer when a few thousand of them die in some great battle, and not once does anyone stop to ask where they came from, or what they wanted, or whether they had names or families, or a dull Tuesday somewhere in there like the rest of us. Tonight, I want to sit with that for a while. Not in a heavy way, just slowly. The way you'd pick up some odd little object off a shelf at 1 in the morning and turn it over in your hands and go, huh, that's stranger than I thought. Because the lore of the orcs really is strange. It's much stranger than the tidy version most people carry around. Where they actually came from is a bit of a mess, and it's a mess for a genuinely fascinating reason. There are more kinds of them than you'd ever guess. They had their own language, their own miserable little social ladder, and at least one conversation in the books where they come across as almost unbearably human. And underneath the whole thing, there's a knot that Tolkien himself, the man who dreamt all of this up, spent decades trying to untangle, and by most accounts, never quite managed before he died. So that's roughly the plan. We'll wander through where orcs came from and why the answer kept changing on him. We'll go through the different breeds, the big soldier ones and the little put-upon ones, and a couple you've probably never heard of. We'll poke gently at the genuinely uncomfortable material, the theology and the breeding, though I'll say now, I'm not going to linger on the grim bits any longer than they're owed. And we'll drift out somewhere quieter than you might expect, thinking about what all of it meant to the bloke who invented it. If you're new here, and you fancy more of this sort of thing, there's a subscribe button floating about somewhere. No rush, it'll still be there in the morning. Otherwise, get comfortable. Settle in properly. This is going to meander, and it's meant to, and there's no exam at the end. Let's start where these things usually start, with a simple question that turns out not to be simple at all. What actually is an orc? Here's a fact that trips people up constantly, and I spent a good chunk of my own life getting it wrong. So no judgment. An orc and a goblin are the same thing. They're the same creature. There's no real difference between them. Goblin is just the word Tolkien reached for when he was writing in a homelier, more fairy tale voice. And orc is the word he used when he wanted something older and harsher and a touch more frightening. In The Hobbit, which is a children's book at its core, they're nearly always goblins. By the time you get to The Lord of the Rings, which is very much not a children's book, they're mostly orcs, same beings, different coat of paint depending on the mood of the page. Tolkien actually left a little note about this at the front of some editions, more or less saying, look, orc isn't an English word, and where it turns up I've usually just translated it as goblin, or hobgoblin for the bigger ones, which I find rather charming, honestly. This idea of him as a translator rather than an inventor, tidying up some ancient manuscript for us and swapping in words we'd recognise. And that gives us our first little breed, almost by accident. Hobgoblin. In our world, a hobgoblin is usually a friendlier, more mischievous sort of house spirit, but Tolkien flips it and uses it to mean a larger, nastier kind of orc. It only shows up once or twice in his writing, and he never really fleshed it out. So most people reckon he just meant the big ones, and later found better words for them. Still, I like that it's in there. A leftover. The elves, being elves, had their own word. In their tongue an orc was an orc, and if you had more than one of them coming at you, which you usually did, that became Urch. It's the word Legolas hisses when they turn up, and the word the guards in Lothlorien use, short, sharp, spat out. You can hear the disgust in it without needing a translation. Now, if you only know Orcs from the films, this is where things get a bit muddled, and it's worth untangling. Peter Jackson made a choice, a reasonable one for the screen, to split them visually. In his Moria, you get these skittery, pale, spidery little goblins swarming down the pillars, and they feel like a completely different species to the great slab-shouldered Uruk-hai stomping about in Isengard. That's a lovely bit of filmmaking, and it's given a couple of generations the firm impression that goblins are the small ones and orcs are the big ones, and never the twain shall meet. But that's the films doing film things. In the books, the words slide around freely. The same creature can be a goblin in one breath and an orc in the next. Tolkien wasn't running a taxonomy department. He was writing the way old stories are written, where the names for a thing shift depending on who's telling it and where they're from. Which, funnily enough, is a hint about the orcs themselves, because they came from all over, in all sorts of shapes and sizes, and there was never one neat label that covered the lot of them. Some were squat and bow-legged, some were tall, some had a look of men about them, and the reason for all that variety goes right back to the beginning, to a very dark place, under some mountains, a long time before any of the stories we actually watch on screen. So let's go back there next and have a look at where the very first orcs are supposed to have come from. Picture a lake in the dark before there was a sun or a moon, just starlight on the water. This is right at the beginning of things, in the far east of the world, at a place called Cuivienen, which more or less means the water of awakening. And it's here, by this lake, under nothing but stars, that the very first elves open their eyes. That's the image Tolkien gives us, the eldest of all the peoples, waking up in the quiet, learning to speak by naming the things they could see. Water, star. The idea makes me a bit wistful every time, honestly. It's such a gentle way to start a world. But not everyone by that lake had gentle intentions. The most widely accepted story of where orcs came from, the one Tolkien's son Christopher chose for the published Silmarillion, is genuinely one of the bleakest things in all the lore, and it starts right here. In those first years, before the good powers of the world had even found the elves, the Dark One had already found them. His name at this point is Melkor, though he picks up the name Morgoth later, and he is, for all practical purposes, the Middle-earth equivalent of the devil. And the story goes that he crept about the edges of that starlit water and took some of the elves. Just took them, snatched them out of the dark before anyone knew to protect them. And what he did with them is the part I'd rather say plainly and then move past, because it doesn't need dressing up. He took them down into his fortress, and by slow cruelty, over a very long time, he broke them, ruined them, twisted them in body and mind until what came out the other side was no longer an elf at all. It was something bent and hateful and afraid. And those, so the story goes, were the first orcs, bred, as Tolkien puts it, in envy and in mockery of the elves, a deliberate insult carved out of the thing he most resented. There's a detail in there I can never quite shake, which is the mockery of it. It isn't just that he made something evil, it's that he specifically made a rotten copy of the most beautiful people in the world, on purpose, to spite them. And the orcs, forever after, are the bitterest enemies the elves have, which makes a horrible kind of sense once you know they were the same people, once. The fortress where all this happened has a name too, actually, two names over the ages. The first great stronghold was Utumno, and when that was eventually smashed by the good powers in a war, a lot of Morgoth's creatures scuttled off and survived in the pits and tunnels and deep places that were left. Later, he built a second fortress called Angband, and the orcs bred and multiplied down there in the dark, in enormous numbers, and eventually came spilling out across the north of the world. So by the time the proper stories get going, there are already far too many of them to count. Vast, dark multitudes spreading out under the mountains, and I think that's worth sitting with for a second, because it changes how the battles read. Every orc horde you ever see, every faceless wave of them, is downstream of that lake. Descendants, thousands of generations on, of a handful of frightened people who were stolen out of the starlight and never got to go home. They probably had no idea. They were just born into the dark, born already hating, born already at war, and they never knew there'd been another version of them that walked by the water and named the stars. It's a properly sad thought, that, and I'll be honest, it's the thing that first made me want to actually understand Orcs rather than just count them as scenery. Now, I've told you all that with a fair amount of confidence, as though it's simply the truth of the matter. And for a lot of fans, it is the truth. It's the version most people settle on. But I have to be straight with you. It's not that simple, and it was never that settled. Not even in Tolkien's own head. The man changed his mind about this more times than you'd believe, right up until the end of his life. And the reasons he kept changing it are, to me anyway, even more interesting than the story itself. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about a writer who couldn't stop rewriting the same paragraph for 50 years. Here's a fun thing about Tolkien, and it's the sort of thing that makes me like him more, not less. He was a tinkerer, a fiddler. He could not leave his own work alone. And nowhere is that more obvious than with the Orcs, because over the course of his life, he gave something like 8 different answers to the question of where they came from. 8. And at the point where he died, he still hadn't decided which one he believed. Let me give you the rough tour, because the range of it is genuinely funny once you lay it all out. The earliest idea, going right back to his writing in the years around the First World War, was that Morgoth made the Orcs out of, and I love this phrase, the heats and the slimes of the earth. Their hearts were of granite, their bodies deformed. Very primordial, very much monsters bubbling up out of the ground. In another early version, they're made of stone. There's a real dark magic and a laboratory flavour to those first drafts. Then over the years it drifts. At one point they're children of the earth, corrupted. Then comes the corrupted elves version we just talked about, which arrives properly in the 1930s and is the one that stuck in most people's minds. Then later still he floats the idea that they were corrupted men instead, which causes its own headaches, as we'll see. At another point he wonders if some of them, at least, were talking beasts, just clever animals that Morgoth taught to walk and speak and do his bidding, like the world's most miserable pets. And at yet another point, he considers whether the leaders among them might actually have been fallen spirits, lesser demons wearing orc-shaped bodies. There's even a version where Morgoth makes them by scattering bits of his own power and malice into them. Heat and slime, stone, corrupted elves, corrupted men, talking beasts, fallen spirits, dispersed evil. It's a lot of options for one type of creature. Now, if you're the sort of person who wants a fandom to just hand you the one true answer, this is maddening. And I do get that, but I've come round to finding it rather lovely. Because what you're actually watching, when you line these versions up, is a man wrestling with his own imagination for decades and refusing to accept an answer that doesn't sit right with him. He wasn't changing it because he was careless. He was changing it because every version created a new problem, and he was too honest a thinker to just paper over the problem and move on. It reminds me a bit of the way an obsessive craftsman will keep sanding the same joint on a piece of furniture, long after anyone else would have called it finished, because he can still feel the tiny snag that nobody else would ever notice. Tolkien could feel the snag in the Orcs. He kept picking at it, and the reason his son had to make a call and pick one version for the published Silmarillion is that Tolkien never made the call himself. Christopher, who spent his whole life sorting through his father's papers, gathered up all these contradictory scraps and essays and published them separately so we could see the workings. And when you read them, the contradictions aren't a mess so much as a diary. You can watch the idea evolve. You can see him talk himself out of one version and into another, and then, years later, quietly back again. So when people ask me where Orcs come from, the honest answer is that there's no single answer. and that the lack of an answer is the interesting part. It's not laziness in the text, it's a fault line running right through the middle of the whole legendarium. And every one of Tolkien's attempts to patch it was really an attempt to solve a much deeper problem underneath. A problem that had nothing to do with monsters and everything to do with what he believed about the world. So that's where we should go next. Because to understand why he kept rewriting the Orcs, you have to understand the one rule he built his entire universe on, and why the Orcs kept breaking it. So here's the rule. The one everything else hangs off. Tolkien was a devout Catholic, properly devout, the kind that shaped how he saw absolutely everything, and he built that worldview right into the bones of Middle-earth, whether he meant to or not. And one of the deepest bits of that worldview is a simple, quite beautiful idea. Only the Creator can create. Real making something genuinely new and alive, with a soul in it, is a holy act, and it belongs to the one God of his world, Ilúvatar, and to nobody else. Everyone below him, all the great spirits and powers, even the good ones, can only shape and arrange and sing along with what already exists. And the evil ones, Morgoth chief among them, can do even less than that. Evil, in Tolkien's world, cannot create anything at all. It can only take what already exists and ruin it, mock it, twist it into a bitter parody of the real thing. That's the whole nature of evil, as he understood it. It's not a rival creative force, it's a spoiler, a vandal. It has no workshop of its own. You actually hear this rule spoken out loud in a moment most people don't clock. When Gandalf faces the Balrog on the bridge and calls himself a servant of the secret fire, that secret fire is this exact thing. It's the divine spark, the power of true creation and true life, and it belongs to Ilúvatar. Gandalf is basically saying, I serve the real thing, the making, the light, and you're just a shadow that got above itself. Gives me a little shiver every time, knowing what's underneath it. Right, now hold that rule in your head and look back at the Orcs, and you can feel the trap closing. Because if evil cannot create life, then Morgoth cannot possibly have made the Orcs. Not really. Not from scratch. Whatever the Orcs are, they can't be a brand new living species that Morgoth cooked up. Because that would mean evil had done the one thing evil is absolutely forbidden from doing in this universe. It would mean the devil had learned to create, and that is the snag Tolkien kept feeling. That's why the origin story kept sliding around. Every time he tried to write the Orcs as simply Morgoth's creatures, made by him, belonging to him, he ran headlong into his own deepest rule and had to reverse out again. The Corrupted Elves version is really an attempt to solve this. It says, but Morgoth didn't make them. He stole something that was already alive and already had a soul, and he ruined it. That keeps the rule intact. Ilúvatar made the elves. Morgoth just defiled a few of them. No creation, only spoiling. Tidy. Except it isn't tidy, because it drags in a whole new problem, an even more uncomfortable one, which we'll get to in a moment. Every solution Tolkien reached for was like this. It plugged one leak and sprang another. I think what I find most affecting about all this is that it's a theological problem disguised as a fantasy problem. On the surface, he's just deciding some lore about goblins. Underneath, he's asking a question that serious people have argued about for centuries. Where does evil actually come from? If the world was made good by a good God, can something be born wrong, through no fault of its own? And if it can, whose fault is that really? Tolkien didn't set out to write a treatise on any of that. He set out to write a story, with monsters in it. But he was too careful and too sincere to let the monsters be simple, and so the monsters dragged him straight to the deepest water there is. And the deepest part of that water, the bit he genuinely could not find a flaw beneath, was a single question. Not where orcs came from, something worse, whether they had souls. So let's wade in there next, gently, because it's the strangest and saddest corner of the whole subject, and it's the one that troubled him most. This is the one. If there's a single question that kept Tolkien up at night about his own creation, by most accounts, this is it. Do orcs have souls? And the reason it's such a nightmare is that both possible answers lead somewhere he really didn't want to go. Let's take them one at a time, slowly, because it's actually a lovely little logic puzzle once you stop being frightened of it. Say the orcs do have souls. That follows quite naturally from the corrupted elves idea, doesn't it? Elves have souls, everyone agrees on that, so if orcs are just ruined elves, then they've kept their souls through all the ruining. And really look at how they behave. They talk, they argue, they make jokes, grim ones, but jokes. They fear death, they plot, they hold grudges, they have opinions about their bosses. That is not the behaviour of an animal. That's a person. A horrible person, maybe, but a person with an inner life going on behind the eyes. But if that's true, then something quite dreadful follows. It means every orc has the same spark in it that every elf and every man has. It means, in Tolkien's own framework, that an orc could in principle choose to turn away from evil. That somewhere inside, even the worst of them, is the possibility of saying, no, I don't want to do this anymore. And if that's true, then all those heroic battles where the good guys mow down orcs by the thousand start to look a bit different. Because you're not clearing out vermin. You're killing people who were made wrong by someone else, who never chose the side they were born on, and who might, under other stars, have been saved. That is a genuinely uncomfortable thing to have sitting under your triumphant battle scenes, and Tolkien knew it. All right then, flip it. Say orcs don't have souls. Say they're just beasts, clever animals, biological machines that Morgoth wound up and pointed at his enemies. That solves the killing problem nicely. You can slaughter them with a clear conscience, the way you'd not lose sleep over swatting a wasp. Lovely. Except now you have to explain the talking. You have to explain the jokes and the grudges and the little dreams of running off to be free. How does a soulless animal do any of that? And Tolkien's attempt to wriggle out of this is, I have to say, one of the more chilling ideas in all his private writings. He suggested that maybe talking isn't proof of a soul after all. Maybe the orcs weren't really thinking when they spoke. Maybe their speech was more like a recording, words and patterns that Morgoth had pressed into them long ago, playing back on a loop, so that they only sounded like they had minds. The way a parrot sounds like it understands you. Beasts of humanized shape, he called them, made to look and sound like people, specifically to mock the real thing, but hollow underneath, just reeling off records set in them by their maker. I don't know about you, but I find that far more disturbing than any amount of blood and fangs. The idea of a whole people who look like they're alive inside, who seem to want and fear and hope, but who are actually just echoing something evil that was recorded into them thousands of years ago and can't be switched off. That's proper nightmare fuel, quietly, and the fact that Tolkien reached for it tells you how badly he wanted the other answer to not be true. But this is the part I find most telling, the detail that I think shows you the man's heart most clearly. In the end, despite all the wriggling, he couldn't bring himself to write the orcs off completely. In his later thinking, he landed somewhere gentle and difficult all at once. The wise of Middle-earth, he decided, taught that orcs were not evil to begin with, and so they deserved compassion, even if they still had to be fought. Even the enemy. Even these. He just couldn't hand himself the easy version, where they don't count. He never fully solved it. He turned it over for the rest of his life. And he died with the puzzle still in pieces on the desk. And honestly, I think that's the right place to leave it too. Unsolved, a bit haunting, the sort of thing you can lie in the dark and mull over without ever landing. So let's leave it there, gently, and come back up into daylight, or at least into the slightly more solid ground of who these orcs actually were day to day, starting right at the bottom of the heap, with the ones nobody ever thinks about. Let's talk about orc society for a bit, because it's grim in a way that's almost relatable, and it turns out there's a proper pecking order among them. At the very bottom you've got the Snaga. That word, Snaga, comes from the Orcs' own harsh tongue, and it means slave. That's it. That's what the big ones called the little ones. Not a species name, not a tribe, just a slur really. A way of saying you're beneath me, and you do what I tell you. The Snaga were the smaller, weaker Orcs, the ones sent to do the fetching and carrying and scouting and dying in the front rank. And they got bullied relentlessly by the bigger, stronger Orcs above them. And I find that oddly bleak, the fact that Orc life wasn't some united army of evil marching in step. It was a cruelty pyramid. The whole thing ran on fear pointing downwards. The big ones terrorized the medium ones. The medium ones terrorized the small ones. And the small ones, the Snaga, had nobody left to terrorize except each other. There's no solidarity down there, no brotherhood. Morgoth and later Sauron didn't just make an army, they made a system where everyone's boot is on someone else's neck, top to bottom. And I think that's the point. That's what evil organized looks like in Tolkien's world. Not a team, a hierarchy of misery. It gets bleaker when you realize how divided they were, even beyond the slave and master thing. The Orcs didn't get on with each other at all. They hated their own kind, almost as much as they hated everyone else. And because they were scattered across so much of the world, in so many separate holes and strongholds and mountain ranges, they splintered into hundreds of little tribes, maybe more, each with its own grudges and its own way of doing things. There was no grand Orc nation. There was a sprawl of squabbling gangs who happened to share a maker and a general direction of hatred. You can imagine the atmosphere of the place. Nobody trusts anybody. Everything is settled by who's biggest. Kindness would get you nothing but a reputation for weakness, and weakness got you a knife. It's a horrible way to live, and the more you look at it, the more you realise the Orcs weren't really being rewarded for serving the Dark Lords. They were just surviving inside a machine that had been designed quite deliberately to grind them against each other, so they'd never have the wits or the unity to turn on the boss, which is the cruelest part of the Snaga when I sit with it. These are, at the bottom of everything, the descendants of stolen people, and the reward for all those thousands of years of loyal service to evil is to be at the bottom of yet another cruel ladder, kicked around by their own kind, called slave in their own language, and thrown at the enemy first so the important ones can hang back. There's no version of the Orc where he's winning. Even the Orc's own society treats most Orcs like rubbish. I'll be honest, I didn't expect to feel sorry for a goblin when I first started reading into this properly. And here we are. There's something in the sheer thanklessness of it. The little put-upon foot soldier, terrified of the sergeant, terrified of the enemy, terrified of the Dark Lord miles away, who he'll never meet, just trying to get through another day in a world that has never once been on his side. Anyway, not all Orcs were Snaga, obviously. Somebody had to be doing the bullying. And the top of that pile, the big terrifying soldier Orcs everyone actually pictures when they hear the word, have a story of their own, and it's tangled up with one of the most famous misunderstandings in the whole fandom. So let's climb up the ladder a bit, from the slaves to the soldiers, and talk about the Uruks. Right, the big lads. The Uruks, if you've seen the films, you know exactly the ones I mean. The huge, black, heavily armoured brutes that come marching out of Isengard chanting. The ones who actually give the good guys a proper fight instead of just dying in heaps. Those are Uruks, and they were a genuine cut above your ordinary Orc. Bigger, stronger, tougher, smarter even, and disciplined in a way regular Orcs never managed. Where a normal Orc rabble would break and squabble, the Uruks could hold a line. And there's one particular thing they could do that made them properly dangerous, which is that they could walk about in the sunlight without wilting. That matters more than it sounds, because ordinary Orcs really don't like the sun. It weakens them, saps them, makes them miserable and slow, which is a big part of why Orcs are creatures of caves and night and deep places. An army you can only field after dark is an army with a serious scheduling problem. So breeding an Orc that could march at noon was a nasty bit of innovation. It took away one of the few reliable advantages the free peoples had. Now here's the famous misunderstanding, and I do enjoy clearing this one up, so bear with me. Almost everyone, thanks to the films, believes that Saruman invented the Uruk-hai, that he was the mad genius in the tower who first bred these super orcs in his pits at Isengard. And it's a great scene, the whole clawing its way out of the mud birth of it, very memorable. But it's not quite right. Sauron got there first. The great soldier Uruks first appeared out of Mordor, bred by Sauron back in the Third Age, well before Saruman was up to anything. Saruman didn't invent them, he copied them. He saw what his old master was doing, or learned of it somehow, and set about making his own version in his own stronghold. So the Uruk-hai aren't a Saruman original, they're a Saruman knockoff, which, when you think about Saruman's whole character, his envy, his imitation of Sauron, his desire to be a Dark Lord himself, actually fits him perfectly. He was always a copyist at heart. Even his masterpiece was somebody else's idea. The word itself is worth a moment, because it sounds grand and turns out to be delightfully plain. Uruk-hai. Break the thing in half, and all the menace drains straight out of it. The first part is just the orcs' own name, for their own kind. The second part is their word for a crowd, a people, a bunch of lads. Push the two together, and this dreaded title, the one these towering warriors growl out before they come at you, works out to something close, to the orc people. That's it. Nothing grander than that. It's either fearsome or a bit anticlimactic, depending on your mood. And I go back and forth on it. There's a useful distinction buried in the language too. Strictly speaking, that word Uruk was reserved for the big soldier orcs, the ones pouring out of Mordor and Isengard. It was a term of a certain respect, if orcs can be said to respect anything. The lesser orcs, the little put-upon ones we just talked about, well, the Uruks looked down on them and called them by that other word, slave. So the whole soldier and slave divide is baked right into the vocabulary. The big ones had a proud name for themselves, and a sneering name for everyone smaller. Some things about armies never change. So that's the Uruks, Sauron's grim invention, Saruman's grim imitation. But I mentioned that Saruman, being Saruman, couldn't just copy the homework and leave it there. He had to go one step further, into something darker and, frankly, worse. Because breeding a better orc wasn't enough for him. He started mixing things that were never meant to be mixed. And that brings us to the one bit of orc lore that even Tolkien seemed to want to hurry past. So let's go there next, carefully, and not linger. There's a quiet moment in the books where Treebeard, the old tree shepherd, is talking about Saruman, and he's clearly rattled by something he's seen. He mutters about dark business in the pits of Isengard, some nasty tampering with living things, and he turns a few possibilities over out loud. Perhaps Saruman has found a way to make the orcs bigger and hardier. Perhaps he's taken men and dragged them down towards the beasts. Or perhaps, worst of all, he's found a way to fuse the two together. The old Ent honestly can't tell what he's looking at, and that not knowing is the whole point. Whatever Saruman was up to down there, it was turning out creatures that fit none of the old familiar boxes. And there's a strange figure earlier in the story that most first-time readers walk straight past. Back in Bree, in that little inn, there's a squint-eyed, sallow, unpleasant southerner hanging about. And there's something a bit off about him. Something that isn't quite fully human. Later on, once you know what to look for, a lot of people reckon that fellow was one of Saruman's creations. An in-between thing, a half-orc. And that's the quietly horrible detail, isn't it? He wasn't lurking in some distant fortress. He was sitting in a pub in a peaceful little town, ordering a drink, watching the door. Evil doesn't always come over the hill in armour. Sometimes it's just the odd-looking bloke in the corner who watches you a bit too long. So what actually were these half-orcs and goblin men? And here's where I'm going to do what Tolkien himself did, which is state the thing plainly, and then move on without wallowing in it, because it doesn't need wallowing in. What Saruman did, and what Tolkien only ever spelled out in his private papers, was breed orcs and men together. That's the blunt version, and the road to it, as Tolkien sketched it, is one of the bleakest ideas in the whole legendarium, because it doesn't begin with orcs at all. It begins with ordinary men, worn down across long generations under a dark master until their minds and their ways had sunk to something barely above a beast's, debased, hollowed out, and once a people had been dragged that low, they could be paired off with orcs to breed new sorts, bigger, sharper, crueler, men who were part orc and orcs who were part man. Tolkien called this Saruman's wickedest deed. Not one of his bad deeds, his wickedest. And I think it's worth pausing just long enough to understand why that word is so strong, because on the surface, Saruman does plenty of things that seem worse. He wages war, he tortures, he wrecks a beautiful land and turns it into a factory floor. But Tolkien reserved his harshest judgment for this, the breeding, and I think it's because of what it represents. Every other evil act is a thing you do to people. This is an evil done to the very idea of what a person is. It's taking two kinds of being and forcing them together to manufacture something new and wretched, purely so you'll have better soldiers. It's treating living, unsouled creatures as breeding stock, as raw material. And given everything we talked about earlier, about souls and creation and the things only the creator is meant to do, you can see why this landed as the ultimate corruption for Tolkien. Saruman wasn't just being cruel, he was playing at being a maker, with living people as his clay. And that's really as far as I want to take it, because turning the mechanics of that over in any detail does nobody any good. Tolkien's own instinct, once he'd worked the idea through, was to name it plainly and then step smartly back from it. And that seems exactly right to me. So that's what we'll do here. Note it, shudder a little, and carry on. But it does leave a thread hanging that's worth following into stranger territory, because Saruman's half-orcs are the low, grubby, industrial end of orc tampering. There's a much older and much weirder idea buried in Tolkien's notes about a kind of orc that might not have been a bred creature at all, but something wearing an orc like a costume. So let's go and look at that. It's the sort of odd, dusty corner of the lore I find genuinely fun to poke around in. Here's a name you'll only bump into if you go digging around in the older, dustier layers of Tolkien's writing. Bolldog. In some of the early tales, Bolldog turns up as an orc captain, a leader of orcs marching about, doing captain things, getting into fights with elves. Perfectly ordinary on the face of it, just another named villain in the ranks. But Tolkien, in that tinkering way of his, went back and added a note that quietly turns the whole thing sideways. He suggested that Bolldog might not be a personal name at all. It might be a title, or even the name of a particular kind of orc. And more than that, he floated the idea that a Bolldog might not really be an orc in the ordinary sense whatsoever. The idea he was reaching for is genuinely eerie, so let me lay it out. Remember how we said the leaders among the orcs might, in one version, have been fallen spirits rather than bred creatures. This is that idea in its purest form. Tolkien mused that scattered through the orc ranks, especially in positions of command, there may have been evil spirits, lesser demons if you like, who had taken on orc-shaped bodies. They looked like orcs, they marched with the orcs. To anyone watching them line up for battle, they'd be indistinguishable from the horde around them. But inside, they weren't corrupted flesh at all. They were something older and colder, wearing a body like a suit of clothes. And a Bolldog, in this reading, is one of those. Not a big orc, a demon in an orc costume, sent to lead and to stiffen the ranks, and to be far more dangerous than it looked. I find this properly unsettling in the best way, the way a good ghost story is unsettling, because it means that when you're looking at an orc army, you might not be able to tell which of them are merely wretched, twisted creatures, and which of them are something genuinely monstrous, just pretending to be one of the lads. The captain barking orders might be a broken elf descendant, with the recorded malice of Morgoth playing on a loop inside him. Or it might be an actual malevolent spirit that has clothed itself in orc flesh specifically so it can walk among them unnoticed. And there's no obvious way to tell the difference from the outside. It also, I think, tells you something about how Tolkien pictured evil working. It doesn't just corrupt from below, twisting the weak. It also infiltrates from above, planting its own agents in disguise, riddling the enemy's ranks with hidden horrors. That's a very old and very frightening idea, the notion that some of the faces in the crowd aren't people at all. Now, I'll be straight with you, this is deep-cut stuff. Bolldog barely appears. The idea was never fully developed, and you could read all the main books a dozen times and never once trip over it. It lives in the notes and the fragments, the workings rather than the finished picture. But that's exactly why I wanted to include it, because I love that these odd, half-formed ideas are sitting there in the foundations of the world. And once you know they're there, the orc hordes never look quite the same again. There's a texture to it, a sense that the lore goes down much further than the surface ever lets on. Anyway, while we're on the subject of things that were bred or built to be tougher than they had any right to be, there's a close cousin to this whole orc project that I've always found a fun little tangent. It isn't really about orcs at all, strictly speaking. It's about trolls. But it rhymes with the orc story in a way that's too neat to skip. So let's have a quick wander over to it before we come back. You know how the Uruks got that nasty upgrade of being able to march about in daylight? Well, the Dark Powers pulled almost exactly the same trick with a completely different creature, and I think it's a lovely bit of parallel engineering. So let's have a look. Trolls. Big, slow, enormously strong, famously not the sharpest, and they've got one glaring weakness that anyone who's read The Hobbit knows well. Sunlight turns them to stone. That's the whole gag with the three trolls early in The Hobbit. Bert and Tom and William, the ones bickering over how to cook the dwarves. Gandalf just has to keep them arguing until dawn, and the moment the sun comes up, that's it, they're statues, permanent garden ornaments. It's a proper fairy tale weakness, the kind of thing that keeps trolls from ever being too much of a threat, because you only have to survive them until morning. So of course, somebody had to go and fix that. By the time of the Great War at the end of the Third Age, Sauron had produced a new breed of troll that didn't have the sunlight problem. They could come out by day and stay flesh, stronger and more cunning than the old stone at dawn variety, and far more useful as weapons of war because you could actually rely on them when the sun was up. And in a nice echo of the orc people we talked about, these ones were called the Olog-hai. That ending, remember, just pointed at a folk or a kind, so if the Uruk-hai were the orc people, the Olog-hai are near enough the troll people. Same naming logic, same grim project, just aimed at a bigger and dumber lump of muscle. Nobody's ever entirely sure how it was done. The same shadow hangs over it as hangs over the daylight Uruks, some dark art or breeding program that Tolkien gestures at without ever fully explaining. And honestly, I quite like that he left it vague. The mechanics aren't really the point. The point is the pattern. Whenever the Free Peoples had some reliable little edge, some rule they could count on, the enemy set about engineering it away. The sun weakens orcs. Right breed orcs that don't mind the sun. The sun kills trolls. Right breed trolls that shrug it off. It's the same move over and over. This relentless chipping away at the assumptions the good guys were leaning on. There's something almost modern about it when you frame it that way. It's an arms race. The enemy isn't just numerous and cruel. It's iterating, improving the product, finding the weakness in the last model and patching it in the next. And that, I think, is part of what makes Sauron scarier than a simple monster. He's not just strong, he's a developer. He takes notes, he rolls out upgrades. Anyway, the Olog-hai are a small footnote really. They don't get a lot of page time, but I've always enjoyed them as a companion piece to the orcs. Two different creatures, same dark workshop, same trick. And it's a nice reminder that the orcs weren't the only thing being tinkered with down in those pits. They were just the biggest and most numerous product line. Right, let's leave the trolls to their stomping and come back to the orcs proper, because there's a side of them we've barely touched yet, and it's one of my favourite bits. Not how they fought, or how they were made, but how they talked. Because the orcs had a language of their own, and the little we know of it is genuinely fascinating, and includes at least one joke that Tolkien buried in there that still makes me smile. So let's do orc language next. Tolkien was, first and last, a language man. That's the thing people sometimes forget about him. He didn't build Middle-earth so he'd have somewhere to put a story. He built it, in large part, so his invented languages would have somewhere to live. He was a professor of this stuff. He made up tongues for fun as a young man, and the whole vast world grew up around them, like a garden around a few seeds. So it should be no surprise that even the orcs, even the lowest and nastiest people in the whole place, got a language of their own. And the little scraps we have of it are a real treat. The main one is the Black Speech, which was Sauron's own invented tongue, deliberately harsh and ugly, designed to be spoken by his servants. You've actually heard a line of it whether you realise it or not. The words on the One Ring, the ones Gandalf speaks aloud in Rivendell that make the whole room go cold and dark. That's Black Speech. It's the only proper sample of it we get, and it's meant to sound genuinely wrong in the mouth. All grinding consonants and menace. Tolkien built it to be unpleasant, and he succeeded a bit too well. By some accounts, the sound of it unsettled people at readings. But beyond that grand cursed inscription, we've got a handful of everyday orc words scattered through the books. And I love these because they're so ordinary and functional. There's gash, which means fire. There's tark, which was the orcs' rather contemptuous slang for a man of Gondor. And there's that word for slave we met earlier, which tells you something about a culture, doesn't it? When one of the few bits of vocabulary that survives is the word for the person at the bottom. My absolute favourite, though, is a word that turns into a joke you might have missed entirely. There's an orc word, Sharku, which means old man. And late in the story, when the hobbits get home and find their peaceful shire has been taken over and industrialised by a fallen wizard, that wizard is going by a nickname his orc followers gave him, Sharky, which is just Sharku, old man, dressed up a bit. So Saruman, this proud, ancient, powerful being who wanted to rule the world, ends his days being called, essentially, Old Man, by his own goblins, as a sort of grudging, rough affection or mockery, and he's adopted it as his name. There's something so bleakly funny and so sad about that. The great wizard, reduced to a nickname that means old geezer. No note, sir, perfect. Here's the detail about orc language that genuinely delights me, though. The orcs hated each other, we've established that, and they were scattered into all these separate tribes across the world. Well, that had a knock-on effect on their speech, because they were so divided and so full of malice even towards their own kind, their language splintered. Every group, every settlement drifted into its own dialect until orcs from different regions could barely understand each other. And so, and this is the bit I love, they often had to fall back on the common tongue, ordinary Westron, the everyday human language, just to communicate between tribes. Imagine that. A whole people so spiteful and disunited that they can't even keep hold of their own shared language and end up having to speak the enemy's tongue to talk to each other. That's not a design flaw, that's a portrait of what hatred does to a community, rendered as linguistics. Oh, and one more, because it's lovely. The Grey Elves had a name for the orcs taken all together, for the whole roaring mass of them. They called them the Glamhoth, which means more or less the noisy host, the din folk, the din horde, which is such a perfectly elvish bit of disdain, isn't it? Not a name that grants them any dignity, just a weary observation that they're loud. You can practically hear the elf sighing as he says it. Speaking of orcs actually talking, there's one scene in the whole of Tolkien where we really get to eavesdrop on them properly, at length, just being themselves with no heroes around. And it's one of the most revealing and strangely touching things in the books. So let's go and listen in on it next. There's a moment near the end of the second book, over in the tower at the pass where Frodo gets caught, when Tolkien does something he almost never does. He lets two orcs just talk. Not to a hero, not for our benefit, not delivering menace at the good guys. Just two of them, off duty in their own world, having a natter. Their names are Gorbag and Shagrat, a couple of orc captains, and the conversation we overhear between them is, for my money, one of the most quietly extraordinary things in the whole of The Lord of the Rings. Because they sound like people. They sound, honestly, like two soldiers in any war anywhere, grumbling. They moan about their commanders. They complain that the higher-ups don't tell them anything and hang them out to dry. They're nervous about the way this whole campaign is going. They've got a sense that something's off, that the bosses are making mistakes and it'll be the likes of them who pay for it. And then, most strikingly of all, they start dreaming a little. One of them muses about how nice it would be to slip off after all this is over, get away from the big bosses, find somewhere quiet with a few trusty lads and no one important breathing down their necks and just set up on their own. Be their own masters for once, and I don't know how you're meant to hear that and not feel something. That's not the voice of a mindless monster. That's the voice of a working stiff who's sick of his job and his managers and just wants a bit of peace and autonomy at the end of it all. It's the most human that orcs ever get, and Tolkien gives it to us right in the middle of the enemy's own fortress, in the mouths of two creatures we're otherwise meant to be rooting against. Now, plenty of readers have looked at that scene and gone, hang on, did Tolkien just accidentally make his monsters sympathetic? Did he forget they were supposed to be evil? And there's a meme version of this where people ask, was the man just being careless? But I don't buy that at all, and I think the scene is far cleverer than it gets credit for. Because look at what actually happens next. Having just shared this almost tender little dream of freedom, of getting away and looking after each other, these same two orcs immediately fall to pieces. They find that mithril shirt on Frodo, the priceless little coat of dwarf mail, and the moment there's something valuable to fight over, all that camaraderie evaporates on the spot. The tower descends into a bloodbath, orcs turning on orcs, captains killing each other, the whole garrison tearing itself apart over a shiny thing, until there's almost nobody left standing. The very lads who were just fantasizing about a quiet life together end up gutting one another in a stairwell. And that, I think, is the actual point. And it's a bleak and brilliant one. The tragedy of the orcs isn't that they can't imagine something better. It's that they can imagine it, they can almost taste it, the freedom and the loyalty and the peace, and then they can't hold on to it for 5 minutes, because the malice bred into them corrodes everything the moment it's tested. They dream of brotherhood and then murder each other over loot. The good impulse is there. It's just been so thoroughly poisoned that it can never survive contact with reality. That's so much sadder than if they were just simple beasts. They're people who get a glimpse of the door and then knife each other before anyone can reach it. I think about that scene a lot, genuinely. It's the whole soul question we chewed on earlier, but dramatised instead of argued. You want to know whether orcs have an inner life? Well, here it is, right here. Two of them dreaming out loud about a better world and then destroying each other on the spot. Make of it what you will. Anyway, Gorbag and Shagrat are far from the only orcs with names. There's a proper rogues gallery of famous ones across the ages, some of them major players in their own right, and a couple with stories that are genuinely good fun. So let's do a bit of a roll call of the notable orcs next. Most orcs die anonymous. That's rather the point of them from a storytelling angle. They're the horde, the mass, the countless. But a handful across the ages actually got names and stories, and pulling a few of them out of the crowd is a nice way to spend a bit of the night. Let's start with a couple from The Hobbit because they're the most fun. When Bilbo and the dwarves get captured under the Misty Mountains, they're hauled in front of the Great Goblin, this big, unpleasant ruler of the Goblin Warren down there. He doesn't last terribly long, mind you. Gandalf turns up and sorts him out in fairly short order. But he's a proper storybook villain while he's on the page, all bluster and threats in his torchlit hall. And then there's my favourite bit of orc-related silliness in all of Tolkien, which is the Goblin King called Golfinball. Now the story goes that long ago there was a hobbit hero, a Took, unusually big and bold, who rode out to fight this Golfinball and his goblins. And in the battle, he swung a great club and knocked the Goblin King's head clean off. And the head sailed through the air and came down 100 yards away and dropped neatly into a rabbit hole. And Tolkien tells us that this is the very moment the game of golf was invented. Club, head into a hole, golf. It's such a daft little gag tucked away in a children's book, and it's exactly the kind of dry throwaway joke that makes me love him. He builds this vast, solemn mythology and then can't resist a pun about golf involving a decapitated goblin. Brilliant, but not all the famous orcs are comic relief. Some of them cast a long shadow, and the big two come as a father and son pair, Azog and Bolg. Azog was a great orc chieftain of the Misty Mountains, and he's the one who kicked off one of the bloodiest feuds in Middle-earth history, the long war between the dwarves and the orcs. It started with an act of real cruelty, Azog killing and defiling a dwarf king, and the dwarves, who nurse a grudge like nobody else, came for him with everything they had. That war rumbled on through a series of brutal battles and cost both sides horribly. It ended at last, outside the great dwarf hold of Moria, where Azog finally met a dwarf tough enough to kill him. The dwarves won, but at such a price that they didn't even feel like celebrating. It's one of those grim, exhausted victories that Tolkien does so well, where everyone just stands about, among the bodies, feeling hollow. And then there's Bolg, Azog's son, who inherited the family business of hating dwarves. Bolg ruled the northern orcs from a stronghold up in the mountains, and years later, when the events of The Hobbit came to a head, it was Bolg who mustered a great host of orcs and came storming down to the Lonely Mountain. That's the Battle of the Five Armies, the enormous scrap at the end of The Hobbit, where dwarves and elves and men, who'd all been about to fight each other over treasure, suddenly have to unite because a sea of goblins has turned up wanting all their heads. Bolg leads that orc host, and Bolg dies in it. And with him, the orc power in the north takes a hammering it doesn't recover from for a good long while. There's one more pair worth pulling out, because between them they give you a lovely little snapshot of orc politics actually happening. When Merry and Pippin get snatched, they end up in the hands of a mixed warband that's had its own throat the entire way. On one side there's Ugluk, a big proud captain of Saruman's Uruk-hai, under orders to get the hobbits back to Isengard alive and unspoiled. On the other, there's Grishnak, a sly, hunched orc out of Mordor, who doesn't answer to Saruman at all, and has his own agenda entirely, and the two of them simply cannot stand each other. They snarl, they threaten, they very nearly come to blows over the prisoners, and over whose authority counts for anything out there in the empty grass. Even on the simplest errand, orcs of different masters just cannot pull together. And there's a genuinely creepy thread to Grishnak, because he seems to half sense that the hobbits are carrying something precious, some instinct tugging at him, his grasping hands always creeping towards them in the dark. He never quite works out what it is, mercifully. But what stays with me is the sheer dysfunction of it. Two groups of the enemy so busy loathing each other that the hobbits slip free, while the orcs argue amongst themselves. Their own spite does half the hero's work for them. Not for the first time in these stories, and not for the last. What I take from the named orcs, taken together, is that the orcs weren't just background hazard. They had leaders with ambitions and grudges and family lines. Azog wanted revenge and territory. Bolg wanted to finish what his father started. These are recognisable motives. Nasty ones, pursued nastily, but recognisable. It's another one of those little reminders that keeps creeping up on you the deeper you go, that the Horde is made of individuals, and some of them had names, and reasons, and sons. Which raises a question I've been circling for a while and might as well come out and ask, because it's the sort of thing that nags at you once it occurs to you. Where do baby orcs come from? It sounds like a joke, but it's a real gap in the lore, and the answer, or the lack of one, is properly strange. So let's have a look at that next. So this is one of those questions that sounds a bit silly right up until you actually try to answer it, at which point you realise there's a genuine hole in the world where the answer should be. Do orcs reproduce? Are there baby orcs? Are there, and I ask this with a completely straight face, female orcs? Let's start with what we can say for certain, because we can say a little. Orcs do reproduce. They must. We just talked about Azog and Bolg, and Bolg is described plainly as Azog's son. That's a father and a son, which means somewhere in the picture, orcs are being born the ordinary way, and there's a whole family structure implied that we simply never get shown. And Tolkien confirms the general principle elsewhere, when he writes that the orcs had life, and multiplied in the same manner as the other peoples of the world, the elves and men. That phrase, multiplied after the manner of the children, is doing a lot of quiet work. It means orcs weren't conjured or manufactured one by one in a vat. They had children. They bred. There were generations. The horde renewed itself the way any population does. But here's the strange part, and it's strange precisely because of how completely it's avoided. In all the thousands upon thousands of orcs across all of Tolkien's writing, we never once meet a female one. Not a single named she-orc. No mothers, no orc children on the page, no domestic scene of any kind. It's all soldiers and captains and slaves and warrens. The entire reproductive family side of orc existence is just a blank. A locked room the story never goes into. And I think that blank is interesting rather than a mistake, though people argue about it. Part of it is simply the kind of story Tolkien was telling. We only ever see orcs in the context of war, because war is where the heroes bump into them. We meet them at the sharp end, in armies and dungeons and battle lines. We never see their home life for the same reason. We never see the enemy soldiers in a lot of old war stories doing the washing up. That's not where the camera points. So the mothers and the children are presumably back in the deep places, in the warrens, out of sight, keeping the whole grim population going, and we just never visit. But part of it, I suspect, is that Tolkien himself didn't want to look too hard at it either. Because the moment you start seriously picturing orc family life, orc mothers, orc infants, orc childhoods, the whole thing gets unbearably sad and complicated. All those questions about souls and innocence and whether they were evil from birth come flooding straight back. Except now they're wrapped around a baby. Is an orc infant evil? Was it born hating? If you can imagine an orc child, can you imagine a good one? It's a rabbit hole that leads somewhere genuinely upsetting. And I don't blame him one bit for leaving the door shut and pointing the story elsewhere. So the honest answer to do orcs breed is yes, clearly, they must. The law requires it and even states it. But the how and the who and the what it looked like is one of the great deliberate silences of Middle-earth. There's a whole hidden half of orc existence that Tolkien knew had to be there for the numbers to work, and chose, I think wisely, never to show us. Some blanks in a story are more powerful left blank. Right, we've come a long way tonight, from a starlit lake to the family arrangements of goblins. And there's really only one big question left hanging, which is what happened to all of them in the end. After the last great war, after Sauron fell, where did all the orcs go? So let's follow that thread down towards the close, gently, because it's a quieter and sadder note than you might expect. When the great war ends, when the ring goes into the fire and Sauron is finally undone, there's this extraordinary moment that Tolkien describes on the battlefield. The orcs, who a second ago were a disciplined, terrifying army, suddenly lose all their fight at once. The will that was driving them just vanishes, because that was the thing holding them together, you see. Not loyalty, not a cause, not belief in anything. It was Sauron's will, pressing down on them, aiming them. And the moment that will is gone, they come apart. Some of them run. Some of them wander in circles, purposeless, not knowing what to do with themselves. Some just stand there, without the Dark Lord to point them. The whole vast machine of them simply stops meaning anything. And I find that one of the most haunting images in the entire story, quietly, because it tells you what the Orcs really were at the end of the day, not a people with their own dreams and drives, whatever flickers of that we saw here and there. Functionally, they were a weapon, a tool, pointed and fired by someone else. And when the hand holding the weapon is destroyed, the weapon doesn't celebrate its freedom, because it never learned how to want anything for itself. It just falls to the ground, inert. As for what happens to them after that, Tolkien is deliberately a bit vague, and I've come to think the vagueness is the honest answer rather than a gap. The Orcs don't get a dramatic extinction. There's no scene where the last Orc dies and a chapter closes on them. They just dwindle. The armies are scattered and broken. The great strongholds fall. The ones bred at Isengard had already been smashed earlier at that big battle at the fortress in the mountains. And the survivors slink back into the wild places, the deep mountains and the dark corners, and slowly fade out of the story. They don't vanish overnight. They diminish. They become a lesser and lesser thing, a fading menace on the edges of a world that's moving on without them. There's a real melancholy to that if you let yourself feel it. Here's a people, if we're allowed to call them a people, who were brought into being for one reason and one reason alone: war, service, hatred. That's all they were ever for. That's the only note they were ever given. And then the war ends, and the master is gone, and there's suddenly no purpose left, and no place for them in the new age of the world. The age that's dawning belongs to men, to peace, to green things growing back over the scars. And there's simply no role in it for a creature that was designed from the ground up to be a soldier in someone else's dark army. They don't get to lay down their arms and become farmers. They just become obsolete, left over. A thing the world no longer has any use for, wandering the edges of somebody else's happy ending. I keep coming back to the fact that none of them chose any of this. Not the being made, not the being pointed, not the being discarded when the war was done. They were stolen into existence at the start, driven through it by a will not their own, and then abandoned at the end when the will let go. From the lake in the dark all the way to the empty battlefield, the Orc never once got to steer his own life. And whatever you decide about their souls, and we very much did not settle that earlier, there's something genuinely mournful in a whole kind of being living and dying entirely as a means to someone else's end. So that's roughly where the Orcs go. Not out with a bang, just a long, quiet fading into the corners and the caves, and eventually out of the tales altogether. Before we let the night wind down though, I want to wander a bit outside the story itself, into our own world, because the Orcs have roots on this side of the page too. The very word is older than Tolkien, and the creatures owe a great deal to things he read and made and lived through. So let's spend the last long stretch of the night out here, in the daylight world, starting with something small and satisfying, where the word orc actually comes from in the first place. So we talked earlier about the language of Mordor, the harsh little scraps of black speech, but the word orc itself, the one we use, has a real history in our world, and it's the sort of thing that lights Tolkien up, because this is exactly the kind of buried treasure he spent his whole professional life digging for. Tolkien wasn't just a novelist who happened to know some old languages. He was a serious scholar of them. His day job, the thing he was actually paid to do, was studying Old English, the language of the Anglo-Saxons, the deep rootstock of the English we speak now. He spent decades among these ancient texts, and one of the things he loved most was finding a strange old word that had mostly fallen out of the world, and pulling it back into the light and giving it a new life. And that's precisely what he did with orc. The word turns up in Old English, where it seems to have meant something like a demon, or an evil spirit, or a monster from the dark. It's genuinely old, genuinely spooky, and genuinely almost forgotten. And if you go looking, it appears in one of the most important poems in the whole English tradition, Beowulf, which Tolkien knew about as well as any human being who has ever lived. Buried in Beowulf, there's a list of the monstrous, unhallowed creatures of the world. The brood descended from the first murderer in the old stories, and among them are the giants and the elves, and a word that scholars connect to orcs, ancient demon things, lumped in with all the other creatures that lurk beyond the edge of the firelight. There's also a thread running back to the Latin word orcus, which was a name for death itself, or for a god of the underworld, the grim power that swallows the dead. And you can feel how that flavour clings to the word. Death, the underworld, the dark, the thing that takes you. It's all in there, humming away underneath four little letters. So when Tolkien reached for the word orc, he wasn't making a nonsense sound up out of thin air. He was doing what he loved best. He was reaching back 1,000 years and more into the oldest layers of his own language and picking out a genuine word for a genuine old horror and carrying it forward into a new story. He gave a forgotten demon word a whole new body to live in. And I think there's something quietly lovely about that. This idea that his monsters aren't inventions so much as revivals, old fears with the dust blown off them. It also explains that little note of his we mentioned right at the start, the one where he says orc isn't really an English word, and he's only translating with it. That's him playing his favourite game, pretending to be the humble scholar who found an ancient manuscript and is simply rendering it faithfully for us, when in truth he's the one who wrote every word. He built a fake old language for the orcs, and then reached into a real old language for the name we'd call them by, and stitched the two together so neatly you'd never see the seam. That's the philologist at play. He couldn't help himself, and thank goodness for that. The wider point, and it's one I find genuinely warming, is that this is how the whole of Middle-earth was really made. Not out of nothing. Out of scraps of the real deep past, old words and old poems and old fears, lovingly rescued and rearranged into something new. The orcs are a perfect little example. An old English demon wearing a made-up black speech name, marching through a modern story. Layers on layers on layers. Now we know where their name comes from, and where they come from, but I've said surprisingly little about what an orc actually looked like, up close, and what these creatures could do with their hands. Because for all their brutishness, orcs were makers of a sort. Not nice things, mind, but things. So let's have a look at the orc up close next, and at the grim little industry they ran. Let's actually picture one for a minute, because I've been talking about orcs all night, and I've barely described the things. The tricky bit is that there wasn't one standard orc. They varied a lot, region to region, breed to breed, almost as much as men do. But the general impression you get from the books is of a creature that's broad and squat and powerful, often bow-legged, with long arms and a bit of a lurch to the way it moves. The skin tends towards sallow or swarthy or grey. The faces are flat and unpleasant, with fangs, and there are claws rather than proper fingernails on some of them. The eyes are made for the dark, which fits everything we know about their love of caves and their loathing of the sun, and they smell apparently. Tolkien mentions the reek of them more than once. So all in all, not a creature you'd want to meet, and not one you'd want to be downwind of either. The bigger soldier breeds we talked about earlier were a different proposition, taller and blacker, and more upright, more like a terrible parody of a big strong man than the scuttling goblin thing of the deep mountains. But across all of them, there's this shared quality of being a mockery, a twisted echo, a thing shaped roughly like a person, but wrong in every particular. which, given where they came from, is exactly the point. They were made to be a foul copy, and they look it. Now here's the part I find genuinely interesting. Orcs could make things. They weren't just brutes with clubs. They were smiths and miners and engineers of a grim sort. They forged their own weapons and armour, crude and cruel, but effective. They dug vast tunnel networks. They built engines of war, wheels and devices, and nasty, clever machinery, especially later on under Saruman, whose whole operation at Isengard becomes this filthy, roaring factory of the things. Orcs, it turns out, are industrious. They graft. There's a whole grim little economy of orc labour humming away under the surface of every dark stronghold. And this is the crucial thing, and it ties right back to that deep rule we spent time on earlier. Orcs never made anything beautiful. Not once. They could copy, they could improve on a design for killing, they could churn out weapons and wheels and armour by the ton. What they could never do was create something good, something lovely, something with any grace or joy in it. And that's not an accident, it's the same principle we met before playing out in their workshops. The kind of making that produces beauty just wasn't available to them because it belongs to the light, and they'd been cut off from the light a very long time ago. So they made only tools of destruction and ugliness. Extremely competently, mind. Just never anything you'd want to keep. Tolkien has this idea that runs all through his work, that evil is fundamentally uncreative. It can be enormously clever, enormously industrious, terrifyingly good at engineering, but it's forever stuck copying and corrupting and never truly inventing. And the orcs are the clearest illustration of it. A whole civilization of skilled craftsmen who, in thousands of years of hammering and forging and building, never once made a single thing you could call good. That's a bleak sort of talent to have. All that skill, pointed only ever at wrecking and killing, is genuinely one of the saddest details about them when you dwell on it. This immense wasted competence. I sometimes think that's the real horror of Isengard, more than the army. It's the sight of all that energy and ingenuity and hard graft, all those wheels turning and furnaces roaring, and the knowledge that not one scrap of it will ever produce anything but harm. A vast workshop that can only make weapons. Industry with the soul scooped out of it. Anyway, we've covered what they looked like and what they built. There's a homilier question I've skipped, which is simply how orcs got through the day. What they ate, how they lived, what an ordinary rotten orc existence actually consisted of between the battles. It's grim, but it's grimly fascinating. So let's poke at it gently next. Right, the domestic side of things. Not the family side, we've established that's a locked door, but the everyday practicalities. What did an orc actually eat? How did it keep itself going between all the marching and fighting? And the answer is, unsurprisingly, not pleasant, but it's interesting in a grubby sort of way. Orcs were meat eaters first and foremost, and they weren't remotely fussy about the source. They'd eat more or less anything, and the books drop some heavy hints that this included things you'd really rather they didn't eat. There's a strong implication running through the story that orcs would happily eat the flesh of men, and possibly, when times were hard or tempers short, each other. In that tower scene we listened in on, there's a grim little exchange about a prisoner and what is and isn't allowed to be done to him, and the casual way they discuss it tells you everything about how orcs regard other living things. As potential food, mostly, if the rules would let them. It's a horrible detail, and Tolkien handles it with a light touch, more implied than described, which I actually think makes it land harder. You fill in the blank yourself, and your imagination is worse than anything he'd have written. They had a drink too, a proper orc draught, this fiery foul liquor that they'd pour down themselves, and when they had prisoners, down the prisoners as well. We see it happen. It burns going down, it sets the guts alight, but it works. It jolts strength back into tired limbs and gets you marching again. It's the orc equivalent of the world's roughest energy drink, basically. Not pleasant, not kind, but effective, which is the orc way in a nutshell. Everything they had was crude and harsh and did the job and gave you no comfort at all in the doing of it. Interestingly, and this surprises people, orcs also had a bit of medical knowledge. They knew how to patch themselves up. They had salves and remedies for their own wounds, rough field medicine for keeping soldiers in the fight, and they were famously hard to kill and quick to shrug off injuries that would lay a man out flat. Tough as old boots, the lot of them, and able to endure hardship and hunger and rough country that would break a softer creature. So they weren't helpless without their masters. They could look after themselves, after a fashion. They just chose, or were made, to point all that hardiness in one direction. But the thing about orc daily life that I find most telling isn't the food or the drink. It's their relationship with the living world around them. Orcs hated growing things, genuinely hated them. Where orcs settled, the land died. They cut down trees for the sheer wasteful use of them, to feed their fires and their furnaces, and they left the ground poisoned and bare behind them. You see it most vividly around Isengard, which starts as a green and pleasant place, and ends up a blasted wasteland of pits and smoke and stumps, all in the service of the war machine. That's the orc footprint on the world. Scorched earth, felled forests, filth in the streams. And I think that's a deliberate and rather profound choice on Tolkien's part, because he loved growing things about as much as any writer ever has. Trees especially. So to make his ultimate foot soldiers of evil into creatures who instinctively destroy green life, who look at a forest and see only fuel, that's him telling you something about the nature of the thing he's writing about. Evil, in his world, isn't just cruel to people. It's at war with life itself, with growth, with beauty, with the slow, patient green business of things flourishing. The orc chopping down a tree he doesn't even need is, in miniature, the whole of what Tolkien feared. So that's your orc's day. Rough food, rougher drink, a scar left on the land, and precious little joy in any of it. It really was a wretched way to exist, start to finish. We've spent a long time now down among the small details of orc existence. There's one more of those worth turning over before we lift our eyes back up to the man who imagined the whole lot. And it's the big one that hangs over every living thing. How long an orc actually lasted, and what became of it in the end. So let's have a quiet think about orc mortality next. So, orc mortality, it's a genuinely murky corner, this. And like so much else about them, Tolkien never fully nailed it down, but there's enough to sketch a picture. The clearest thing we can say is that orcs were not immortal. Whatever else was uncertain, that much held. The elves, remember, are deathless in the ordinary sense. They don't age and wither the way we do. And if the orcs really were made from ruined elves, you might expect a bit of that to carry over. But it doesn't seem to. Orcs die. They can be killed, obviously, in enormous numbers. But beyond that, they also sicken. They catch diseases. They wear out. They were mortal creatures, with mortal spans, subject to all the ordinary frailties of the flesh. And by most readings, they were actually quite short-lived by nature. A brief, harsh candle of a life, in other words, guttering out fast, which, if you think about it, only deepens the general bleakness of the whole orc condition. Not only is it a wretched life, cruel and thankless and pointed entirely at war, it's a short one, on top of everything. You're born into the dark, driven through a nasty, brief existence at the sharp end of somebody else's war, and then you're gone. And another one is bred to take your place. High turnover, cheap and disposable, even to their own masters. Sauron never worried about losing orcs the way a general worries about losing men, because there were always more coming up from the Warrens, and none of them were going to be around long anyway. There's a wrinkle, though, and it's a fun one. A few of the great orc chieftains seem to have lived a good long while. That feud between the dwarves and the orcs that we talked about, the one that ran from Azog down to his son Bolg, that spans a serious stretch of years. And the big chieftains involved appear to hang about far longer than any short-lived foot soldier would. So it may be that the leaders, the strongest and cleverest of them, were tougher and longer lasting than the common rabble, which fits in a grim way. The powerful orcs get more of everything, including more time. Even orc lifespan seems to run on that same miserable ladder where the ones at the top get the lion's share and the snagger at the bottom get almost nothing. Now the obvious next question is what happens to an orc after it dies? Where does it go? And here I'm going to gently decline to reopen the whole business, because you'll remember we spent a good while earlier tangled up in the question of orc souls, and I'm not dragging us back into that maze at this hour. I'll just say that whatever you decided about whether orcs had a spark in them, the fate of that spark after death was one more thing Tolkien turned over and never settled. If there was something in there, where did it go when the body fell? He mused about it, the way he mused about everything to do with orcs and left it hanging, the way he left so much of this hanging. Another loose thread in a subject that's basically made of loose threads. What I'm left with, sitting with all of it, is a kind of being that never once got a comfortable moment. From the first day to the last, not one. And that, more than the fangs or the armies or the theology, is the thing that turned the orcs, for me, from monsters into something closer to a tragedy. Which brings us finally to the man who felt that tragedy more keenly than anyone. Because he was the one who made it, and who never stopped worrying about what he'd made. Let's go and sit with Tolkien himself now, and the very real darkness he was drawing from. It's a gentler note to end on than you might think. To understand the orcs, I think you have to understand that the man who made them had seen hell up close, in this world, when he was very young. Tolkien was a soldier in the First World War. He went out to France in 1916, a young man not long married, and he served through the Battle of the Somme, which is one of the most infamous and appalling episodes in the whole history of warfare. If you know anything about the Somme, you know the shape of it. Mud that swallowed men whole, barbed wire and machine guns, waves of young lads climbing out of trenches and being cut down in their thousands by weapons that turned killing into something mechanical, industrial, done at scale by machines. It was the moment the modern world showed exactly what its new inventions could do to a human body, and it did it to an entire generation. And Tolkien lost his friends there. He'd had this tight little group of school friends, brilliant young men, the sort of intense creative friendships you form when you're young and think you're going to change the world together. And the war took most of them. 2 of his closest died in that same stretch of fighting. He came home himself only because he fell ill with trench fever and got invalided out. Otherwise, he'd very likely have gone the same way. He survived, but he came back into a world with a lot of empty chairs in it. Now this is the part that gives me chills every time I put it together. It was in the aftermath of all that, in the years right around the war, sick and grieving, that Tolkien began seriously writing the mythology that would eventually become Middle-earth. The whole thing, in a sense, grew up out of that soil, out of the mud and the loss and the mechanized horror. And the orcs, when they first crawled into his imagination, came out of the same place. You can feel it, honestly, once you know to look. The orcs are creatures of industrial destruction. They fell forests and foul the earth and serve a war machine and die in nameless disposable waves. That's not medieval warfare he's describing. That's the Somme, dressed up in fantasy. But here's where Tolkien is at his most honest and most troubled, and where I love him most. He was deeply uneasy about his own orcs, because he could see the danger in them. An enemy that's uniformly ugly, uniformly evil, a faceless horde you're allowed to kill without a flicker of conscience. Well, that's exactly how real wartime propaganda paints the actual enemy. That's the lie every war tells about the people on the other side, that they're not really people, that they're monsters, vermin orcs. And Tolkien, who had been in a real war and had presumably been fed exactly that sort of propaganda about the men in the opposite trenches, was uncomfortable that he'd built a race who really were like that. He worried he'd made the lie true inside his story, And so, in his letters, he keeps pushing back against his own creation, trying to complicate it, trying to let the air back in. In one letter written during the Second World War to his son, who was then in uniform himself, he says something that has always stuck with me. He points out that there are orcs on both sides of any real war. Not fantasy orcs, but the orc-like behaviour, the cruelty and the brutality, and that it shows up among your own people just as readily as among the enemy. He's warning his boy, essentially, don't fall for the story that all the monsters are on the other side. The capacity for orcishness is in everyone. It's in us. And in another letter, years later, he says the thing that I think is the truest word he ever wrote on the subject. He describes the orcs, in the end, as fundamentally rational creatures, corrupted, yes, horribly corrupted, but, and here's the line, no more corrupted than plenty of ordinary men you could meet today. No more corrupted than many men to be met today. Sit with that for a second. The great chronicler of the orcs, the man who sent them to die in their thousands so his heroes could shine, quietly telling us that the difference between an orc and the fellow next to you on the bus is one of degree, not of kind, that the orc is not some alien evil. The orc is us, turned a few degrees darker by cruelty and fear and domination. That's a remarkable thing for a writer to say about his own villains. It's humble, and it's humane, and it's a little bit frightening, and it's the reason I've never been able to think of orcs as simple monsters ever since I first read it. So there he is, the young soldier in the mud who lost his friends, grown into the old professor who couldn't stop worrying about whether he'd been fair to his own imaginary enemies. And I think that worry, that refusal to let even the orcs be simple, is one of the most decent things about him. Before we let it all go for the night though, I'd like to visit a couple of actual places on the map. We've talked about orcs as a people and a problem and a puzzle, but hardly at all as neighbours who lived somewhere in particular. And there are two great orc haunts, especially worth a quiet visit. So let's take one last gentle wander to the dark under the mountains and to a lonely peak in the far north, and then we'll call it a night. The first place we have to visit is Moria, because if there's one location that captures what orcs meant to the world of Middle-earth, it's this one, and it's got a genuinely tragic story wrapped around it. Moria wasn't always a place of orcs, far from it. In its day, it was the single greatest work of the dwarves, a vast underground kingdom called Khazad-dûm, delved down and down into the roots of the mountains over thousands of years. Halls of stone and pillars like a forest, and lamps and mithril and craftsmanship that no one has ever matched since. It was a wonder. The dwarves loved it the way you love a home your family has held for 100 generations. And then, in their hunger for that precious mithril, they dug too deep, and they woke something that had been sleeping in the dark since the elder days. A great demon of shadow and flame, one of the old terrors of the world, and it drove them out. The dwarves fled their own masterpiece, and it fell dark and empty, and into that emptiness, over the long years, crept the orcs. That's the pattern, you see, and once you notice it everywhere. Orcs so rarely built their own places. They moved into the ruins of better things. They took the abandoned glories of others and fouled them, filled those beautiful old halls with filth and bones and squabbling, until the very name Moria became a byword for a great and lovely thing overrun by goblins. There's the whole orc condition in one location, honestly. They don't make the hall. They just infest it after the makers have gone. There's a heartbreaking little coda to Moria too. Long after the dwarves fled, a brave and stubborn dwarf lord named Balin decided to go back and reclaim it, to drive out the orcs and light the old lamps again and make Khazad-dûm a dwarf kingdom once more. And for a short while, it worked. But the orcs came for them in the dark, in their numbers, and it ended in slaughter. When the Fellowship passes through years later, they stumble on the evidence of it. A tomb, a ruined chamber, A battered book that records the last desperate days of Balin's people, the writing growing more frantic towards the end, until it stops on the sense of drums booming in the deep and the orcs coming and no way out. It's one of the most chilling few pages in all of Tolkien, and it's chilling precisely because it's so quiet and so final. The lamps never did get relit. The orcs kept the hall. The second place is very different in feeling, and it's a spot most casual fans have never heard of. Mount Gundabad, away up at the top of the world, where the misty mountains meet the grey mountains in the cold north. Now Gundabad matters for a reason that makes its fate especially bitter. In the most ancient days it was a holy place to the dwarves, sacred ground. The very first of the dwarf fathers is said to have awoken there right at the beginning of things, which made it about as revered a spot as the dwarves had anywhere in the world, and the orcs took it. They made this most sacred of dwarf places into one of their chief strongholds in the north, a capital almost, a great breeding ground and gathering point for the northern orcs. You can imagine how that sat with the dwarves. It's hard to think of a more pointed insult, the enemy squatting on your holiest ground and using it to churn out more of themselves. It was from Gundabad that the northern orc power was ruled, in those later ages, by that chieftain we met earlier, the son carrying on his father's long feud. And it remained a dark and dangerous place, a thorn in the north, for a very long time. Two places then, and the same sad shape to both of them. A glory of the dwarves, taken and defiled and turned to orc purposes. I keep coming back to that, because I think it's the truest thing about where orcs lived. They were squatters in the wreckage of beauty. They dwelt in the bones of better worlds. And whatever you feel about the orcs themselves, there's something genuinely mournful about all those magnificent old halls, dug and carved and loved by better hands, echoing at the end with nothing but goblin voices. And on that quiet, slightly melancholy note, in the dark of Moria, with the lamps long cold, I think we can gently bring the whole long night into land. So that's the orcs, or as much of them as one long wandering night can hold. We started, if you remember, with a small complaint of mine that the orcs are the most numerous people in all of Middle-earth and somehow the ones we understand the least. And I don't know if we've fully solved that tonight, because I'm not sure it can be solved, but I hope we've at least sat with them properly for a while, turned them over in our hands, looked at the odd markings on the underside that most people never bother to check, and look at everything that was down there. A starlit lake at the beginning of the world, and elves stolen out of the dark and ruined into something new. A writer who couldn't decide for 50 years what his own monsters really were, because every answer he tried broke one of his own deepest rules. A question about souls that has no comfortable answer in either direction. A whole miserable little society with its slaves and its soldiers and its splintered languages and its dreams of running off somewhere quiet. Named chieftains with feuds and sons. Grim workshops full of wasted skill. Great old halls, dug and loved by better hands, echoing at the last with goblin voices. And behind all of it, a young man who'd been to the Somme and come home to empty chairs, quietly insisting that the orc was never really so very far from us as we'd like to believe. That's the thing I keep landing on, if I'm honest. For most of my life, I thought the orcs were the least interesting thing in Tolkien. Scenery, the stuff you cut through to get to the good bits, and it's turned out to be almost the exact opposite. The orcs might be the most human thing in the whole of Middle-earth. Not the elves with their deathless grace, and not the noble men and their kingdoms. The orcs, the corrupted, the frightened, the used, the ones who never chose any of it and never got a decent moment from beginning to end. There's more of us in them than there is in any of the heroes, and I think Tolkien knew that, and I think it troubled him, and I think that trouble is exactly why they're worth all this attention. There's plenty more we didn't get to, of course, because there always is with this stuff. The trolls deserve a proper night of their own one day, so do the great wars of the elder days, the the ones the Orcs marched through in their countless thousands before any hobbit was ever born. And the Nazgul, the ring wraiths, are a whole other kind of horror I'd love to sit with sometime, in the dark, at an unreasonable hour, so there's no shortage of places for us to wander next. But those are for other nights. For now, there's nothing left to do except let it go. You've done the hard work of staying awake this long, and you're under no obligation to make it to the end. If you drifted off somewhere back around the starlit lake, or the tower, or the cold halls of Moria, then good. That's rather the idea. It'll all still be here, in more or less the same shape, whenever you feel like coming back to it. Thanks for keeping me company through all of it. Sleep well, wherever you've got to in the mountains, and I'll see you on the next quiet, unreasonable night, for something else worth turning over, slowly in the dark. Good night.